There is a moment in the Simpsons movie where Ned Flanders stands on a hilltop with Bart and points out at the land around the town, and he names the states that Springfield borders. He says, Ohio and Nevada and Maine and Kentucky, all at once. And if you know a map of the United States at all, you know that is impossible, because Nevada sits out west near the Pacific, and Maine hangs off the far northeast corner, and no single town could touch both. And that is the joke. After decades on the air, the series had a chance to finally tell us where its little town actually sits, and instead, it gave us a shrug dressed up as an answer. Almost nobody talks about how deliberate that shrug really is. Tonight, we are going through all of it. Every question the program set up and never closed, every disappearance nobody explained, every prediction that turned out to be real, and every one that turned out to be a lie. So get comfortable, turn the lights down low, we will be here a while, and if you have not subscribed yet, it genuinely helps us keep making these. The state of Springfield is the oldest and coziest mystery the cartoon owns, and it is the one Matt Groening has protected the hardest. He has said, more than once, that he chose the name Springfield because it is one of the most common town names in the United States. So common that almost every American has a Springfield somewhere near where they grew up. The idea was that everyone watching would quietly assume the series was set in their Springfield, in their state, near their own childhood streets, and Groening liked that so much that he decided to never take it away from anyone. He said he would happily let people believe whatever they wanted, and if a fan told him Springfield was in their state, he would just agree with them. It is a strange thing to build into the foundation of a show, this refusal to be pinned to a map, but it turned out to be one of the smartest choices anyone made, because a town that could be anywhere feels a little bit like it belongs to you. For years, fans hunted for clues anyway, because that is what fans do, and the show kept dangling little contradictory hints just to keep the hunt alive. The town borders an ocean in some episodes, with a working harbor and a sea captain and a lighthouse, and yet it is placed, in other episodes, in the middle of landlocked country, hundreds of miles from any coast. It has mountains and desert and farmland and a gorge, sometimes in the same half hour. And this is not sloppiness, or at least it stopped being sloppiness very quickly, because the writers realized that the impossibility was funnier and more useful than any real geography could ever be. If Springfield is nowhere, then Springfield is everywhere, and the town can be whatever a particular story needs it to be that week. In 2012, it looked for one afternoon like the mystery had finally cracked. Groening gave an interview to Smithsonian Magazine in which he mentioned that he had grown up near Springfield, Oregon, close to Portland, and that the name had stuck in his head, partly because of the town in the old series, Father Knows Best. Headlines everywhere announced that the secret was out, that Springfield was in Oregon, that Groening had confessed at last. And then he walked it straight back. He told TV Guide, in about as blunt a sentence as he ever gives, that he never said the program's Springfield was in Oregon. He said Springfield was the name of his sled. It is a wonderful non-answer, a little cruel to the people who thought they had won, and it tells you exactly how the man feels about ever settling the question. The Oregon of his childhood may have given him the name. It did not give the cartoon a home. The movie, in 2007, took all of this and turned it into that hilltop gag, the 4 impossible border states, a punchline built specifically so that no clever viewer could ever draw a coherent map. And when people kept asking anyway, the movie's director, David Silverman, gave a half-joking answer that fans have clung to ever since. He said Springfield is in the fictional state of North Tacoma. If you say North Tacoma out loud a couple of times and let the letters slide together, you can hear the initials, NT, hiding in there. Another wink, another door closed, just as it seems to open. There is no North Tacoma. There is no state at all. There was never meant to be. Here is the detail I love most about this whole business, because it shows you the writers were not just avoiding the question, they were actively playing with it. In the 2000th year, near the end of a season, the program aired an episode built as a fake documentary about the so-called real Simpsons, a parody of those breathless celebrity biography shows, and it referred to the family as coming from a specific place. On the first broadcast, the narrator called them a Northern Kentucky family, Some fans believe the staff recorded that line several different ways on purpose, naming several different states, and that later airings swapped the line so that the family became a Southern Missouri family instead. As the story goes, there were more versions sitting in the vault that most people never heard, variants naming Western Oregon, and Eastern Nebraska, and Southern Illinois, and even the Hawaiian island of Lanai. The plan, as it has been described, was that every single rerun could name a different home state, so that anyone trying to catch the answer would be chasing a thing that changed every time they looked at it. They turned Where is Springfield into a joke that literally will not hold still. And the town resists being pinned down in smaller ways too. Ways you might never notice unless you were the kind of person who freezes frames and reads the background signs. There is a road sign in Springfield that gives the town's population as 30,720, a precise, official-looking number. And yet across the rest of the cartoon, Springfield is treated as a real city, with a downtown and a stadium and its own mob and its own nuclear plant, a place that would need many times that many people to function. Estimates pulled from different episodes scatter all across the map, from around 30,000 up past 70,000, and they never agree, because they were never meant to agree. The population of Springfield is whatever the story needs, the same way its location is whatever the story needs. Even the family's own house refuses to be a fixed place. The address settled, eventually, on 742 Evergreen Terrace, and most fans can recite that number in their sleep. But it took the series a long time to settle there, and if you go back through the early episodes, you can find the house wearing a whole series of different numbers before Evergreen Terrace became the one that stuck. Fans who have tracked this have listed off a string of them, numbers in the 1000s and numbers in the double digits, and everything in between, 7 or so distinct house numbers on the same family home, changing from story to story before anyone decided it mattered. And the house itself is just as unstable, with a floor plan that shifts to suit each plot, a second staircase that appears when a scene needs it and vanishes when it does not, a garage that somehow holds both family cars while only being built for one. The Simpsons live in a house that will not stay the same shape, in a town that will not stay in one state, in a country that cannot quite contain it, and none of that is an accident. It is the show telling you, gently and constantly, do not try to map this place, just live in it for a while. That is the tone I want to hold for the whole night. This idea of a mystery that is comfortable rather than frightening, a puzzle you are allowed to give up on, because most of what we are going to walk through has that same quality. The Simpsons has been on the air longer than almost any scripted show in American history, more than 800 episodes now, renewed years into the future, and a thing that runs that long accumulates loose ends the way an old house accumulates dust in the corners. Some of those loose ends are jokes the writers left dangling for fun. Some are accidents that got locked into canon because there was no time to fix them. Some are genuine secrets that the people who made the program kept for years, and a few of them are only now, decades later, being talked about openly. And a strange handful of them are the kind of coincidence that makes people whisper that the cartoon can somehow see the future, which is a mystery all its own, and one we will spend a good long while taking apart carefully, because there is a lot of nonsense mixed in with the few things that are actually true. If the location is the mystery the series never wanted to solve, there is exactly one great mystery it did solve, and it solved it so well and guarded the answer so carefully that the whole thing became a piece of television history in its own right. It is the one everybody of a certain age remembers. The summer that an entire country spent arguing about a cartoon, Who Shot Mr. Burns? The setup is simple enough that you can hold it in your head. Mr. Burns, the ancient owner of the nuclear plant, spends the final episode of the 6th season becoming more monstrous than the town has ever seen him. He builds a giant disk to block out the sun so that Springfield will be forced to buy more of his power. He steals oil from under the school. He wrecks Moe's Tavern and the retirement home and Bart's treehouse. He threatens or ruins nearly every character we know. By the end of the episode, practically the whole town has a reason to want him gone. And then, in the dark, someone shoots him. He staggers out onto a sundial in the town square and collapses, and the screen cuts to black, and the question hangs there, unanswered, for the entire summer. This was the cartoon's first two-part story. The first half aired in May of 1995, at the very end of the sixth season, and the answer would not come until the season 7 premiere in September, almost 4 months later. What happened in those 4 months is the part that has become legend. Fox ran a nationwide contest, tied in with a phone company, inviting viewers to call in and guess the culprit, with a prize on the line for anyone who solved it. And the country took the bait completely. People ran office pools. Newspapers printed theories. Fans combed through the first half frame by frame looking for clues in the reflections and the shadows and the little details in the background. And the writers had, in fact, hidden real clues in there, which made the hunt feel winnable. It was a deliberate echo of an earlier phenomenon, the Who Shot J.R. cliffhanger from Dallas back around 1980, which had already turned a television mystery into a genuine national guessing game, long before the internet made that kind of thing feel normal. Now here is where the story gets good, because the people making the show were absolutely determined that the answer would not leak, and the lengths they went to are wonderful. The program runner at the time, David Merkin, had the team produce more than one ending. They animated and recorded alternate versions of the reveal, in which different characters were named as the shooter. Decoy endings built specifically so that if a script or a reel got out, no one could trust it. In these fake endings, the culprit was, variously, Barney the barfly, or Mo the bartender, and in one of them, the guilty party was even the guest musician Tito Puente, who appears in the story and who, in the decoy, gets to take his revenge in song. The table read of the script reportedly stopped before the final act, so that most of the room never heard the true ending aloud. The information was kept on a need-to-know basis inside the production itself, with only a tiny handful of people trusted with the real answer. And there are accounts that even the episode's director was, for a while, kept in the dark about who really did it while the animation went ahead. And after all of that secrecy, after the disguises and the decoy reels and the country holding its breath, the answer turned out to be the smallest, quietest, most unexpected person in the entire cast. It was Maggie, the baby. The one character who never speaks and never seems to do anything but suck on her pacifier and watch. In the second half, the mystery unravels to reveal that Burns, weakened and wandering, had tried to take a lollipop from the baby, that the two of them struggled, that his own gun was between them, and that it went off in Maggie's hands. She did not mean to do it. It was an accident, a struggle over candy that ended with the town's villain bleeding on a sundial. And the joke, the deep and slightly wicked joke, is that the weapon was never really a mystery at all. It was Burns's own gun, riding in his own holster the whole time, until it slipped loose into the smallest hands in Springfield. There is a final touch that I think is the best part of the whole thing, and it is the kind of detail that separates the people who really thought about this from the people who just wanted a punchline. The original pitch for the shooter did not come from Merkin at all. By some accounts, writers Bill Oakley and Josh Weinstein had wanted the culprit to be Barney, the town drunk, which would have been a perfectly good, sardonic answer. Merkin overruled them. He insisted the shooter had to be a member of the family, because a stranger or a side character solving the mystery would not land the same way. And he chose Maggie specifically because he found the idea of the baby being the answer funnier and stranger than anything else on the table. And then, at the very end of the reveal, after the accident is explained and everyone has more or less agreed to move on, the camera lingers on Maggie for a beat, and her eyes shift, just a little. A tiny, deliberate flicker that the makers chose to leave in, so that a careful viewer could sit there and wonder whether the baby really did fire that gun entirely by accident, or whether something a little colder passed behind those wide, innocent eyes. They solved the mystery, and then, in the last second, they cracked it open again, just enough to keep you thinking. I find that delightful. They could not resist leaving one last little door ajar. The contest has an ending too, and it is almost funnier than the episode. When Fox tallied up the entries and drew a pool of finalists, something like 200 people who had been selected to potentially win, they went to check which of them had actually named the right culprit, and the answer was none of them. Not a single one of the drawn finalists had guessed Maggie. The whole country had spent a summer theorizing, and the real answer was so far off everybody's list that the official contest had no genuine winner at all. So the prize went to a person chosen essentially at random from the pool. The name that has been reported for that winner is a woman from Washington who, by the accounts that circulate, did not really watch the cartoon and, when offered the choice between being animated into an episode of The Simpsons or simply taking the cash, took the cash. There is something perfect about that. The greatest television whodunit of its era, months of national obsession, and the person who technically won the prize did not care and picked the money. Meanwhile, if the story is to be believed, the people who actually cracked it were a handful of obsessives posting on an early internet news group, reasoning their way to the baby from the clues on the day the first half aired, with no prize at all except being right. That, to me, is the shape of nearly every good Simpsons mystery. There is the version the series gives you, and then there is the messier, human, behind-the-scenes version, and the second one is almost always better than the first. Who Shot Mr. Burns is the only one of these puzzles the program ever fully closed, and even then it left the baby's eyes flickering at the end, unwilling to let the box stay completely shut. Some Simpsons mysteries are secrets kept from the audience. Others are secrets kept from the town itself, in plain view, and the purest example of that is a name sprayed on walls all over Springfield: El Barto. If you have watched enough of the show, you have seen it without ever really registering it. 2 words scrawled in dripping paint on the side of a building or across a bathroom stall, a little signature left by a graffiti artist the local authorities can never seem to catch. And the joke, once you see it, is impossible to unsee, because El Barto is Bart. It is Bart Simpson, tagging his own town under a flimsy Spanish-flavored alias, and the running gag is that Chief Wiggum and Principal Skinner, and the whole apparatus of Springfield law and order, spend years failing to solve a case whose answer is stitched right into the vandal's chosen name. The tag goes back almost to the very beginning. El Barto turns up as early as the first season the cartoon ever aired, in the first weeks of 1990, and from there it becomes one of those tiny background threads that reward people who pay attention. Fans who have gone looking have found it hidden all over the place across the years. Painted on the wall inside Moe's Tavern, sprayed on the steps of the public library, scrawled on the wall of the boys' bathroom at the summer camp, tucked onto a dumpster behind the Quickie Mart, marked on the courthouse steps. It is not a one-time joke that got forgotten. Somebody on the crew kept it alive on purpose, hiding it in corners for decades, so that the mystery of who El Barto is could keep not being solved in episode after episode. The vandal is on screen the entire time. He is one of the 4 or 5 most famous cartoon characters on Earth. Nobody in his town ever puts it together. There is a small wrinkle here worth being honest about, a detail that keeps this a running gag rather than a true unsolved crime. Bart is not perfectly secretive about it. There is at least one moment in the series where he more or less admits to Skinner that he is the one behind the tag, so it is not as though the truth is locked away even from him. But the framing that holds up, the framing the program keeps returning to, is that Springfield as a whole never officially catches its most prolific vandal, that the authorities keep treating El Barto as a phantom, an unknown menace, when the culprit is a 10-year-old who has been drawing on their walls in a name that is literally his own. It is a joke about how bad institutions are at seeing what is right in front of them, and it is also just a lovely, low-key mystery that the cartoon was content to never resolve, because resolving it would spoil the fun. If El Barto is a mystery the town solves by refusing to look, the strangest identity puzzle in the whole series is one the town solves and then chooses to bury, on purpose, out loud, in the last minutes of an episode. This is the story of Principal Seymour Skinner, and the day the show decided he was not Seymour Skinner at all. The episode aired near the start of the 9th season, in the autumn of 1997, and it remains among the series' most argued about half-hours ever produced. Out of nowhere, we learn that the man everyone in Springfield has known for years as Principal Skinner, the stiff, mother-dominated, by the book head of the elementary school, is an imposter. The real Seymour Skinner, we are told, was a soldier who went missing in the war and was presumed dead, and the man wearing his name, is actually a former street tough named Armin Tamzarian, who had served under the real Skinner and who, on being told his sergeant was gone, traveled to Springfield to break the news to the man's mother, and then simply, gently, slid into the dead man's life. He took the name, he took the job, he took the mother. He became Seymour Skinner so completely that he seemed to half believe it himself. And then, in the episode, the real Skinner comes home, alive after all, and the town has to reckon with the fact that their principal is a stranger wearing a borrowed identity. What the town does with that revelation is the part that has kept fans arguing for decades. They do not embrace the real Skinner. They find him abrasive, and they miss the man they knew. And so, in a move that only a cartoon could get away with, they effectively run the genuine article out of town, put the imposter back behind the principal's desk, and a judge issues an order that no one in Springfield is ever to speak of the matter again, under threat of punishment. The program, in other words, wrote itself a mystery, solved it in a deeply destabilizing way, and then had a character stand up and command the audience and the town alike to forget the whole thing ever happened. And to a remarkable degree, the cartoon then did forget it. Skinner went right back to being Skinner in the next episode, and the enormous revelation that he was really Armin Tamzarian was mostly treated afterward as if it had never occurred. I say mostly, and I want to be careful here, because this is one of those places where fans sometimes overstate the case. You will hear people say, the episode was never referenced again, that the series pretended it did not exist. That is not quite true. The Tamzarian business did come back at least a couple of times. There is a later fake documentary-style clip show that points to this very episode as an example of the kind of gimmicky, desperate plotting the series had started reaching for, using its own bizarre twist as a punchline about itself. And there is a later episode in which Lisa, wanting to shut Skinner up, simply calls him Tamzarian, weaponizing the buried name to silence him. So the door was not welded shut, it was just very firmly closed, and the show clearly wished it had never opened it. The program's own creators have been unusually blunt about how they feel. Matt Groening has called the episode a mistake, plainly the kind of swing that did not connect and that he would rather not have taken. Harry Shearer, who voices Skinner and who does not often go out of his way to criticize the writing, described the twist as arbitrary and gratuitous, an out-of-nowhere shock with no real payoff. And yet the writer behind it, Ken Keeler, has defended it as some of his best work. And there is a piece of trivia attached to it that I find moving in a way the episode itself never earns. The name Tamzarian was not random. Keeler is said to have taken it from a real person who had helped him after a car accident, a small private thank you tucked inside one of the program's most divisive episodes ever aired. That is the thing about these mysteries. Even the ones the fans hate have a real human fingerprint somewhere in them, a writer smuggling a piece of his own life into the machine. What makes the Skinner story a genuine mystery, rather than just a bad episode, is that the cartoon never actually undid it. There was no later episode that said, actually none of that was true, he really is Seymour Skinner. Forget we said otherwise. The canon of the series, if you take it literally, still contains the fact that the principal of Springfield Elementary is a former delinquent living under a dead man's name, and that everyone agreed to pretend it never came up. It is a solved mystery that the show is too embarrassed to keep talking about and too committed to fully erase. So it just sits there, technically true, quietly ignored, the strangest skeleton in Springfield's very crowded closet. And the more you sit with it, the more it starts to feel like a joke about identity on a show where nobody really has a fixed one, where a man can wear another man's whole life, and a town can decide, collectively, that the comfortable lie is better than the true story. Which, if you think back to a certain founding father we will get to later, is a thing Springfield has done more than once. There is a mystery running underneath every single episode of this show, one so constant that most people stop noticing it, and it is the simplest question you could possibly ask. How old is everyone? When did any of this happen? The Simpsons live inside what people who study these things call a floating timeline, or a sliding timeline, which is a polite way of saying that time does not really pass in Springfield. Bart has been 10 years old for more than 3.5 decades. Lisa has been 8 for just as long. Maggie, the baby who shot Mr. Burns, is still a baby. The parents do not gray, the kids do not grow, and the calendar outside the window keeps turning, so that the same characters who once used rotary phones now carry smartphones, without anyone ever aging a day. It is the deal you make without being asked, the moment you sit down to watch. And normally you make it happily, because it lets the program stay itself forever. The trouble only starts when the cartoon tries to tell you about the past, because the family does have a past, or rather it has several, and they do not agree with one another. Early on, in the second season, there is an episode that tells the story of how Homer and Marge met, and it places that meeting in high school, in the middle of the 1970s, with the fashions and the music and the whole texture of that decade. Homer is a slacker, Marge is an idealist. They fall for each other at the senior prom after a detour that finds Marge going to the dance with someone else entirely, before her heart changes and she comes back for him. It is a lovely, specific, firmly dated origin story. And then, almost 2 decades of real time later, in the 19th season, the series tells the story of Homer and Marge's young adulthood again, and this time it is set in the 1990s, with Marge in college and Homer in a grunge band. The whole thing soaked in the sounds and styles of a completely different era. The two accounts cannot both be true. A couple cannot fall in love as teenagers in the 1970s and also be young and unattached in the 1990s. The program simply moved their entire youth forward by 20 years so that it would keep making sense to a modern audience. And it never once acknowledged the contradiction. That later reboot of their history drew such a strong reaction from longtime fans, who felt something sacred had been casually rewritten, that the show has mostly avoided trying it again so brazenly. But the timeline keeps leaking anyway, because a show this old cannot help it. There is yet another version of how the couple first crossed paths, in which they are said to have met as small children at a summer camp, years before the high school romance, which is its own quiet contradiction folded on top of the others. Pick any character and the same problem appears if you push on it. There is an episode in which Ned Flanders, the relentlessly cheerful neighbor, reveals his age, and the number is 60. He credits clean living and chewing his food thoroughly, and a daily dose of church for keeping him spry. The writers, by their own account, argued about how old they could plausibly make him, went back and forth between the high 50s, and finally landed on 60, purely because it was funnier for this apparently middle-aged man to be secretly ancient. It contradicts how he looks. It contradicts the floating timeline. It contradicts basic arithmetic about his young sons. And it does not matter, because the joke was worth more than the consistency. The cartoon has even used the sliding timeline to rewrite characters we thought we understood. In a recent season, an episode seems to revisit Grandpa, Abe Simpson, showing him in the early 1980s as a much younger man in some sort of tough guy job that fans still debate the details of, which is a very different picture from the doddering old veteran of the Golden Age episodes, and which only works if you accept that Abe's whole life has been sliding forward along with everyone else's. The past is not a fixed place in this show. It is a rubber sheet that gets stretched to reach whatever decade the writers need it to touch this year. And here is where I have to gently correct a thing that gets repeated online, because this show attracts a particular kind of confident wrongness. You will sometimes hear that in one recent season Bart finally turned 11, that the great taboo was broken, and a Simpson child aged at last. That is not what happened. The episode people are thinking of is a fake series finale, a story in which an artificial version of Springfield's future is generated and paraded in front of Bart, and within that fake future, the town throws him a surprise 11th birthday party. But Bart senses that something is wrong. He refuses to blow out the candles, and the whole illusion collapses within minutes and resets him right back to 10 years old, where he has always been. Nobody aged. The series dangled the possibility precisely so it could snatch it away, which is the floating timeline defending itself, on screen, as a plot point. Bart cannot turn 11. The moment he does, the spell breaks, and everybody in the writer's room knows it. The timeline is not the only thing that refuses to stay put. Characters themselves sometimes get swapped out underneath us. and the program turns even that into a joke about how little we are paying attention. The clearest case is Fat Tony, the mob boss. In an episode near the end of 2010, Fat Tony has a heart attack and dies, really dies, and the mob brings in his cousin to take over, a lean, healthy man they call Fit Tony. But grief and stress and the mobster lifestyle go to work on the cousin, and over the course of the episode he eats and drinks and worries himself into the exact same shape as the man he replaced, until he is indistinguishable from the original, and everyone just goes on calling him Fat Tony. So the character you have watched for years is, if you take the cartoon at its word, technically a different man wearing the dead one's outline, an heir who ate his way into becoming the ghost of his cousin. It is the same trick the show plays with the family cat, which has died and been replaced so many times that the current Snowball is something like the fifth animal to hold the name, a detail the series cheerfully admits. Continuity in Springfield is a suggestion, not a rule, and the program would rather make a joke out of the seams than hide them. Homer's own family keeps expanding in ways that violate everything we thought we knew about him too. For most of the early run, he is an only child of a difficult old man. Then the cartoon gives him a long-lost half-brother, a wealthy self-made car executive who finds him and briefly transforms his life before the thread is dropped. And then, seasons later, it casually hands him an English half-sister as well, the product of Abe's wartime posting in Britain, a whole sibling conjured out of a throwaway line, complicating a family tree that never needed complicating. Every one of these additions is treated as though it had always been there, and none of them are ever really reconciled with the others. The mystery of the Simpson family is not any single secret. It is that the family itself is a moving target, a set of relationships that the writers reshape whenever a story needs a new branch, so that after 800 episodes, there is no single, coherent, agreed-upon history of these 5 people at all. There is only the version that was true for 22 minutes, and then the next one. And somehow, against all logic, it still feels like the same family every week, which might be the strangest thing about it. A show that runs for 800 episodes does not just accumulate contradictions, it accumulates absences. People wander into Springfield, become part of the furniture for a while, and then simply stop appearing, and if you watch long enough, you start to feel the empty chairs. Some of these disappearances have real explanations that the series would never tell you inside the story. Explanations that belong to contracts and grief and voice actors who could not do it anymore. And those, to me, are among the eeriest mysteries the show carries, because the answer is real and sad and hidden just behind the cartoon. Start with Ned Flanders, Ned's wife, the mild, devout woman who stood beside him for years. She is killed off, abruptly, at a racetrack, struck by a barrage of promotional t-shirts fired from a cannon into the stands, knocked over a railing to her death. It is a shockingly casual way to remove a long-running character, and the reason behind it has nothing to do with the story and everything to do with a pay dispute. The actress who voiced Maude, Maggie Roswell, had been commuting long distances and had asked for more money, and by her own telling the raise, the studio countered with, felt like an insult. Rather than meet her, the program wrote her character out of existence, dropped by a t-shirt cannon, and Maude stayed dead. The mystery inside the cartoon is why a kind, harmless woman had to die so pointlessly. The mystery behind it is a negotiation that came down to $150, and a studio that decided a human life on screen was cheaper to end than to pay for. The gentlest of these absences is the one the series handled with the greatest care, by handling it not at all. For years, 2 of the funniest side characters in Springfield were the shyster lawyer Lionel Hutz and the washed-up actor Troy McClure, both voiced by Phil Hartman, an enormously gifted performer who made those 2 men into fan favorites with a warmth and a sleaze that nobody could have replaced. In the spring of 1998, Hartman was murdered, killed at home in a tragedy that stunned everyone who had worked with him, and the program made a choice. It did not recast the roles. It did not write the characters a farewell. It did not explain where Lionel Hutz or Troy McClure had gone. They simply never appeared again, retired out of respect, so that 2 of Springfield's most beloved faces vanished from the town with no in-story acknowledgement at all. If you are a child watching the reruns, you might wonder, one day, whatever happened to that terrible lawyer or that sleazy actor from the educational films? And there is no answer inside the show, because the answer is a real man who is gone, and a room full of writers who decided that silence was the only decent tribute. Then there are the disappearances that are stranger, funnier, more purely the cartoon playing with its own machinery. Dr. Marvin Monroe, a shouting, bearded therapist from the early years, was written out and then, in a clip show, casually declared dead, the series killing him off as a piece of throwaway trivia rather than a story. Except he was not really gone. Years later he reappeared, alive, and when a character expressed surprise, he explained, more or less, that he had merely been very sick, a wonderfully lazy resurrection that treats his own reported death as a minor clerical matter. He later turns up again as a ghost. The real reason he faded in the first place is that his voice actor, Harry Shearer, found the characters shouting rough on his throat and did not enjoy performing him, so Monroe drifted out of the program for entirely human reasons, and the cartoon covered the gap by killing him, unkilling him, and never quite settling what his status was. Bleeding Gums Murphy, the soulful jazz saxophonist who becomes a kind of mentor to Lisa, is a gentler mystery. He dies, and Lisa mourns him, and the show gives him a lovely send-off. But the cause of his death is never actually stated on screen. Fans have filled the silence with their own theories, deciding among themselves that it must have been some specific ailment, but the series itself never says, and so the honest answer is simply that we do not know what took him, only that he was there, and then he was not. Another empty chair, another quiet fade. Some vanishings the program turns into open satire, laughing at itself for even having them. In the 8th season, an episode arrives where the cartoon within the cartoon, the endless Itchy and Scratchy show, brings in a hip new dog character named Poochie to boost its ratings, a transparent parody of the way network executives demand that a tired property be freshened up with an edgy new face. Poochie is a disaster, and the cartoon knows it, and so it kills him off within the very same episode that introduced him, flashing an intertitle that dryly informs us Poochie died on the way back to his home planet, a death so instant and so contemptuous that it becomes a joke about the whole practice of adding characters to prop up a fading show. And in that same episode, as a second layer of the same gag, a random young man named Roy suddenly appears living in the Simpson house, never explained, never introduced, a housemate who simply exists, and then he moves out with a cheerful wave and is never mentioned again. A walking parody of a real network note, suggesting the series add a cool young character to attract a younger audience. Roy is a dropped thread that was designed, from the start, to be dropped, a mystery with no solution, because the absence of a solution is the entire point. And then there is Frank Grimes, who might be the most unsettling absence of all, because his story is not really a comedy at any point. Grimes is a man who has worked and suffered for everything he has, and he arrives at the nuclear plant only to watch Homer Simpson, lazy and lucky and beloved, coast through life while doing everything wrong. It drives Grimes to genuine madness. In his final scene, he mockingly imitates Homer's carelessness, grabs high-voltage wires while sneering that he does not need safety gloves because he is Homer Simpson, and he electrocutes himself, and he dies, and the town buries him while Homer sleeps through the funeral. It is one of the darkest things the show has ever done, and it leaves a mystery hanging over it, which is simply why. Why the writers chose to bring in a decent, hard-working man purely to destroy him against Homer's dumb luck, and there is no tidy-sourced statement explaining exactly what they wanted us to take from it, which is part of why fans have chewed on that episode for so long. His absence, at least, was not quite total. As some fans recall it, his son turns up in a later season seeking some kind of revenge on Homer before being stopped, and much later, in a Halloween special, Grimes himself briefly returns as a ghost for a grim little joke. But I want to be precise about that, because it matters. Those Halloween specials are not part of the real story of the program. Nothing that happens in them counts. In the actual continuing life of Springfield, Frank Grimes worked hard, lost his mind watching a fool prosper, and died, and stayed dead, and the cartoon moved on the very next week as if he had never existed, which is, when you think about it, exactly the thing that killed him. The largest absence of all belongs to Homer's mother, Mona, and hers is a mystery the series kept reopening for years. She left when Homer was a boy, vanished into a life on the run from the law for reasons tied to protesting Mr. Burns' company, and she drifts back into Homer's life a handful of times across the seasons, always briefly, always leaving again, so that for a long time her defining quality was simply being gone. Then the program killed her. For real, in an episode that gave Homer a genuine and painful goodbye, and you might have thought that was the end of the mystery of Mona Simpson. But the show was not finished with her. In a much more recent season, it revisits her fate again, and by most fan accounts, the twist lands her somewhere far darker than anyone expected, reframing her entire life of fugitive idealism in a stranger light. The woman who spent the cartoon being mysteriously absent turns out to have a final destination nobody expected, and the series, characteristically, drops that bombshell and then wanders off to the next story, leaving you to sit with the idea that Homer's runaway mother is not resting peacefully anywhere. These are the absences that give the long run of the program its odd melancholy. For every character who is written out with a joke, there is one who is gone because a real person could not or would not come back, and the cartoon has learned, over the decades, to fold both kinds of loss into the same yellow world without ever quite telling you which is which. Now we come to the mystery that has grown far bigger than the show itself, the one you have almost certainly seen shared online, usually as a screenshot with a breathless caption. The idea that The Simpsons can somehow see the future. That it has predicted, again and again, the things that were coming, years or decades before they arrived. This is the part of the night where I have to be most careful, and I want to be honest with you from the start, because a great deal of what circulates under the banner of Simpsons predictions is simply false. It is doctored images and clips ripped out of context, and vague gags twisted after the fact to fit events they never actually described. So we are going to separate the real from the fake, slowly, and you can decide for yourself which side of the line each one falls on. But I promise you the truth is more interesting than the hoaxes anyway. Let us start with the ones that are genuinely real, because there are a few, and they are worth understanding precisely rather than through a blurry screenshot. The most famous is the Trump one. In an episode from the year 2000, a story about Bart imagining his own grim adult future, we see a version of Lisa who has become President of the United States, and in one line, she mentions that she has inherited a budget crunch from, in her words, President Trump. That is it. That is the whole prediction. There is no image of Trump in office, no depiction of an election, no forecast of a movement, just a single spoken line naming him as a former president, written at a time when the man was a tabloid businessman and a punchline. The writer who put that line in, Dan Greeny, has explained since that it was meant as a warning, a joke about America reaching the logical last stop before it hit bottom, choosing Trump as a president, precisely because it seemed absurd. It was satire, not prophecy. And I want to be very clear about what that same episode did not do, because people get this wrong constantly. The series imagined a President Lisa Simpson, a woman in the White House, at a date that has now passed in that fictional future, and that has not happened in reality. No woman has been elected to that office. The episode is not a scorecard the program keeps getting right. It is a cartoon that once, in passing, used a name that later became real. A few of the others are real in the same limited way, a throwaway gag that history happened to rhyme with later. There is an episode from the late 1990s with a background sign describing the 20th Century Fox studio as a division of the Walt Disney Company, which was a joke about corporate consolidation, and which did, decades later, sort of come true when Disney really did buy most of Fox. But notice how the real event differs from the myth. The deal was announced in 2017 and closed around 2 years later, for tens of billions of dollars, and the figure you often see attached to the prediction online is simply wrong. The cartoon made a cynical joke about a media giant swallowing everything, and the world eventually obliged, which is less a prophecy than a safe bet about the direction things were always heading. There is a charming one from an episode set in a far future version of the year 2010, in which we see a character take a call on a little wrist-mounted phone and hold a video conversation with someone far away. That was, at the time, science fiction, and versions of both those things did eventually become ordinary. There is one about physics that fans love, in which Homer, of all people, is briefly shown as an inventor scribbling an equation on a board, and that equation, which was written for the series by a staff writer with a serious science background working alongside a real astronomer, produces a rough estimate for the mass of a fundamental particle that scientists were still hunting at the time. When that particle was finally found, years later, the show's number was in the right neighborhood, the right idea, though off by a real margin, several times too large. It is a lovely bit of hidden craft, but it was a smart guess baked in by educated writers, not a vision. Some of the real ones are darker. There is an early episode featuring a pair of flamboyant stage magicians and their beloved white tiger, and in the story the tiger turns on the men and mauls them, an obvious parody of a famous real-life animal act. Years afterward, one of the real performers that act was based on was really mauled by one of his own white tigers. That one unsettles people, understandably, but it is a parody of a specific act catching up with the real danger that act always carried, not a glimpse of a specific date. There is a beloved one about technology, in which a child's handheld device tries to take a note reading Beat Up Martin and mangles it into Eat Up Martha, a joke about bad handwriting recognition that, according to a former Apple software director, actually became a kind of rallying cry for the team that later built the autocorrect on the iPhone, a case where the program may have nudged the future rather than seen it. And there is the one that gets dragged out during every outbreak, an episode from the early 1990s in which a nasty illness sweeps in from overseas and panics the town. People point to it as proof the cartoon predicted a pandemic. But the writer of that episode, Bill Oakley, has been refreshingly plain about it. He has said it was just a joke based on a real flu from the 1960s, and that the reason it looks prophetic is simply that the episodes are so old that history repeats itself. That if you make enough jokes about disease over enough decades, some of them will line up with a real outbreak eventually. Which brings us to the single most important thing to understand about this entire phenomenon, and it comes straight from the people who ran the series. The longtime showrunner Al Jean has put it as plainly as anyone. If you throw enough darts, he has said, you are going to hit a few bullseyes. The program has produced hundreds of episodes over more than 3 decades, stuffed with thousands of jokes, many of them about politics and technology and disaster, and every one of those episodes was written about a year before it aired, which means the writers were always sketching a slightly exaggerated version of the near future. Do that thousands of times, and the law of averages guarantees that some of your wild jokes will, by pure chance, come to resemble real events. That is not magic. That is volume. And now the other side of the ledger, the part where I need you to trust me, because this is where the internet has been lying to you for years, and this channel is not going to be one of the ones spreading it. A huge number of these viral Simpsons predictions never happened at all. The best known is the claim that the show predicted the coronavirus pandemic. There is a widely shared image that appears to show a Simpsons newscast announcing a coronavirus, and it is a fake. It is a doctored splice, stitched together from that old 1990s flu episode and an altered graphic. In the real footage, the joke was a pun, a newscast about a cat flu, with the words "apocalypse meow," and someone edited it after the fact to make it look like a warning about a specific modern disease. Fact-checkers rated the doctored version as false in the strongest terms, and Bill Oakley, whose work was being twisted, called the misuse of it gross. It never aired. The cartoon never predicted it. Somebody made it up and let it travel. The same is true of a whole parade of others. You may have seen images claiming the series predicted the fire at the Notre Dame Cathedral, or the explosion in Beirut, or various grim things involving specific public figures. Those are fabrications, most of them made or altered after the events they supposedly foresaw. None of them anything the program actually broadcast. There is a clip of Trump riding down an escalator that gets passed around as a prediction, and it is not one, because it was made and posted after he had already announced his campaign, a parody of a thing that had already happened rather than a forecast of a thing to come. And there is one I have to address directly, because it is close to home for anyone who has watched these prediction videos lately, and because getting it wrong is exactly the kind of error that fills our comment sections. There is a claim, spread very hard online, that the cartoon predicted the outcome of a recent World Cup, that it foresaw a final between Mexico and Portugal, with Portugal and a certain famous forward lifting the trophy. This is false. What actually exists is an old episode from around that same era containing a brief fictional advertisement for a soccer match between Mexico and Portugal. That is all it is. It names no World Cup, no year, no final, and no winner. It is background set dressing in a story about something else entirely. And the real tournament it is supposedly predicting did not go that way in the slightest. The actual final was contested by Spain and Argentina, and Spain won it by a single goal. So if you ever see a video telling you the show called a Portugal victory, you are watching someone either fooled or lying, and now you know better. This is the whole reason we go slowly through this material. The fun of the real coincidences is completely spoiled if you let the fakes ride along beside them as though they were the same thing. There is even a fan theory that turns the whole idea inside out, a theory that the series itself cannot really see anything because none of it is real in the first place. This is the notion, passed around for years, that Homer has actually been in a coma since an early 1990s episode, and that everything since has been a dying man's dream, which would neatly explain why the world of the program has gotten steadily stranger and more cartoonish over time. Al Jean, who has heard it many times, calls it an intriguing idea and then flatly says it is not true, and the cartoon has openly mocked the theory more than once. It is a lovely piece of fan invention, and it is exactly that, an invention, not a hidden truth the writers are protecting. The real mystery of the predictions is not how the series sees the future, it is why we so badly want it to. We take a cartoon that has been on the air longer than some of its viewers have been alive, we sift its thousands of jokes for the handful that happened to come true, we ignore the thousands that did not, and we build a legend out of the survivors, because it is a comforting thing to believe that somebody, somewhere, even a yellow cartoon family, saw it all coming. The truth is gentler and stranger. They just kept making jokes, for decades, and the world kept catching up to a few of them. If you want the real hidden history of this show, though, you have to go behind the curtain, into the fights with the network and the episodes that got pulled, and the secrets the writers kept for years about how certain half-hours came to be. This is the part of the story the casual viewer never sees, and it is full of genuine mysteries. Some of them about famous guests, some about censorship, some about episodes that vanished from the air and never fully came back. The largest of these mysteries surrounds an episode from very early in the show's run, the one guest starring Michael Jackson, or rather the one that may or may not guest star Michael Jackson, which is the whole puzzle. In the story, Homer ends up in a mental institution and befriends a large man who is utterly convinced that he is Michael Jackson, a gentle giant with a soft, unmistakable voice. That speaking voice really was Michael Jackson. He recorded the dialogue himself, but he was credited under a false name, a pseudonym, so that his involvement was officially deniable, and here the mystery deepens, because when the character sings, the singing voice is not Jackson at all. It is a sound-alike, a professional impersonator brought in to perform the songs, so that the man you hear talking and the man you hear singing are two different people wearing the same character. And the strangest part is that those who actually made the episode do not agree on why. One account, told on a commentary track, is that Jackson did it as a prank, that he wanted to fool his own brothers with a convincing fake. Another account, from groaning himself years later, is that Jackson's record contract simply forbade him from singing on a project tied to another label, so a substitute had to be used. The makers of the program, the people who were actually in the room, tell it differently from one another, and so the true reason a sound-alike sang in Michael Jackson's place is a thing that may never be fully settled. There is a lovely little tale to that story too, a hidden credit that survived even after the singing was faked. One of the songs from the episode, a sweet birthday song for Lisa, was truly written by Jackson, and when it later appeared on an album of the cartoon's music, his authorship was reportedly concealed behind a pseudonym, a small hidden credit fans have puzzled over ever since. He kept ghostwriting his way through the cartoon under invented names, present and hidden at the same time. And then, decades later, that entire episode disappeared. In 2019, following a documentary that revived serious allegations against Jackson, the program's producers chose to pull the episode from circulation entirely, removing it from streaming and from the packaged collections, so that a piece of the show's own history was erased. I want to be careful and fair about the facts here, because this is a genuinely contested matter and it is easy to get wrong in either direction. Jackson was acquitted in a criminal trial back in 2005. He was not found guilty. But the decision to pull the episode years afterward was driven by the renewed allegations raised in that later documentary, not by any finding that those accusations were false, and the whole question remains disputed rather than settled. The series simply decided it no longer wanted the association and made the episode vanish. So we now have the odd situation where one of the best remembered half hours of the early years is officially gone. Its guest star was never officially there in the first place, and even the reason his voice was only half used is a matter the creators cannot agree on. It is a mystery, wrapped inside a disappearance, wrapped inside a pseudonym. Most of the cartoon's battles, though, were not with the outside world, but with its own network Censors, and the stories the writers have told about those fights are some of my favorite hidden history in all of television. There is an episode from the 8th season about Homer's anxiety over whether a family friend is gay, a warm and pointed story that turns Homer's prejudice into the joke. And that episode nearly did not air at all. The network's standards department read the script and returned 2 full pages of objections, complaining about nearly every line and about any use of the word gay, and formally judged the episode unacceptable for broadcast. It should have been dead, but there was a long delay while the animation was done overseas, and in the months that passed, the network's leadership and its entire censorship team were replaced. When the finished episode was resubmitted to the new department, they sent back a single line: acceptable for broadcast. The exact same episode, condemned by one set of censors and waved through by their replacements, aired uncut, and one of the program's most progressive episodes exists only because the people who wanted to kill it happened to lose their jobs first. The line between what we are allowed to see and what we are not turns out to be almost comically arbitrary, a matter of who happened to be sitting in the office that week. The individual notes those censors sent over the years have leaked out, and they are a strange, granular kind of poetry. On one early episode, a censor reportedly objected to Mr. Burns thanking Marge for not making fun of a certain part of his anatomy, and as the story goes, enough of the staff pushed back in writing that the network eventually backed down. On a Halloween episode, a censor wanted a line about Mr. Burns having employees suckle at his teat, softened into something about sucking at the bosom of his generosity, and the writers kept the original word out of pure stubbornness. On one of the ultra-violent cartoon shorts within the program, a censor wrote a note that has to be one of the great sentences in the history of network television, simply asking, "Please do not show a cat coughing up blood." These were the daily skirmishes, line by line, word by word, between writers who wanted to push and a network trying to hold the leash, and the writers won more of them than you would expect, often by just refusing to blink. The juiciest of those fights, to me, is the one where the show effectively dared its own parent company to sue itself. In an episode poking at cable news, the writers ran a fake scrolling news ticker along the bottom of the screen, full of absurd, pointed political jokes made to look like real headlines. The real news division of the network, which shared a corporate parent with the cartoon, was reportedly furious and threatened legal action over the parody of its style. And the writers simply called the bluff, on the reasoning that the company was hardly going to pay to sue its own cartoon, that the whole thing would be one arm of the business suing another. The lawsuit never came. But the network reportedly changed its rules afterward, said to discourage the series from ever running a fake news crawl again, for fear that viewers might mistake the jokes for genuine headlines. A single gag was powerful enough that the corporation rewrote what its own writers were permitted to do, rather than admit it had been needled by its own show. Not every fight was with the censors. Some were with entire countries. Over the years, the program has managed to offend nations on a diplomatic scale, and several episodes carry real-world consequences that most viewers never learn about. An episode set in Rio de Janeiro, portraying the city with a heavy hand, so upset the Brazilian tourism authorities that they threatened to sue the studio, with backing from the country's president, and the cartoon's veteran producer James Brooks had to issue a public apology to the city and its people before joking about the whole affair. An episode built around a trip to Australia, full of broad national stereotypes, aggrieved Australian viewers enough that some of them wrote to their own members of parliament about it. An episode that leaned on the imagery of New Orleans drew a wave of complaint calls over a single unflattering line, enough that the show put an apology into the very next episode's opening chalkboard gag, having Bart write out that he would not defame that city. There is an episode set in Japan containing a scene disrespectful to the Japanese emperor that is effectively unaired in Japan to this day. Entire governments have taken the cartoon off the air, one country banning foreign cartoons from the early evening hours to protect its own struggling animation industry. Another pulling the series from its schedule and, in a detail I find perfect, replacing it with reruns of a beach lifeguard drama. There is even a persistent report, from around the time of the movie, that the film was blocked in one country because its bright yellow and red color scheme happened to match the colors of a banned opposition movement, though that one lives more as a wire report passed around than a fully confirmed fact. Sometimes an episode became too painful to show, not because of what it said, but because of what the world did afterward. There is an episode from that same period in which the family visits New York, built around the World Trade Center because the towers were such an instantly recognizable landmark, with jokes set at their base. After the towers fell, the program pulled that episode from wide rerun circulation for years, setting it aside because a comedy could not sit comfortably against that memory, before it slowly returned much later. Another episode was edited after the same event to remove shots of the towers from a completely different scene. These are not really mysteries in the puzzle sense. They are the way a show that has been on the air long enough to outlive skylines learns to keep flinching, adjusting itself around the wounds of the real world. But my favorite behind-the-curtain story of them all, the one that best captures how strange the making of this show could get, is the couch gag that a famous anonymous street artist was invited to create. He was handed the opening, the little animated bit before the show proper, and rather than a gentle joke, he storyboarded something bleak, a vision of the show's own animation being produced in a grim overseas sweatshop, with exhausted workers laboring among bones and toxic sludge, small animals fed into machinery to stuff the merchandise, a mythical creature chained up and forced to punch the holes in the discs. It was a savage joke about the real economics of making a cartoon this large, aimed squarely at the program's own hands. And it did not go down quietly. By the artist's own account, it caused real disputes inside the production over what could be broadcast, and led to a threatened walkout by the animation department, people who did not appreciate their work being depicted as a house of horrors, and the network sanitized parts of it before it aired. The series has always been at its most interesting when it turns its cynicism on itself, and here was a moment where that self-mockery got so sharp that the people actually drawing the program nearly put down their pencils in protest. The finished gag, even softened, remains one of the darkest things the cartoon ever put in front of a Sunday night family audience, and the fact that it aired at all is its own small miracle of a network deciding to let its writers cut it that close to the bone. Let us slow down now and drift toward the small mysteries, the ones about how the show came to look and sound the way it does, because the origins of its most familiar things are stranger than you would guess, and they make for the gentlest kind of bedtime puzzle. Take the simplest question of all: why are the Simpsons yellow? It is such a fundamental fact of the series that you never think to ask, but there was a decision behind it, and the reason is beautifully simple. As the story goes, A color stylist working on the early designs suggested the family be yellow, and Groening looked at it and approved it almost instantly, because a flash of yellow while a person is flipping channels does something no other color does. It tells you, without a single word, before you can even register what you are watching, that this is The Simpsons. The color was a branding instinct, a way to make the program unmistakable from across a room. And one of the early writers, Mike Reiss, has added a second, quieter reason that I love, which is that the children have no line separating their hair from their heads. Their hair is just part of the same shape, so a color was needed that could read as somehow both skin and hair at once, and yellow did that job. Television's most recognizable palette came down to catching a channel surfer's eye and solving a drawing problem about where Bart's hair ends. The whole crude, wobbly look of those early years, the thing people either loved or complained about, was itself an accident. When Groening first drew the family for the little bumper shorts that ran on a variety show years before the real series, the shorts that were the family's actual first appearance, he handed in rough, unpolished sketches, quick, scratchy drawings that he fully expected the professional animators to clean up and refine into something smoother. Instead, they traced his rough drawings exactly, line for line, imperfections and all, and that traced roughness became the official style, locked in, the shaky charm of early Springfield preserved by a misunderstanding. The family looked wrong on purpose without anyone actually intending it, and by the time anyone could have fixed it, the wrongness was the brand. Even the names are a hidden map of the man who made them. Homer, Marge, Lisa, and Maggie are the names of Groening's own father, mother, and two sisters, his real family transplanted into a cartoon one, which is a slightly startling thing to realize the first time you hear it. The one name he did not take from his family was Bart, and the reason is a small, perfect joke, because Bart is an anagram of the word brat, the letters of the troublemaker's name rearranged to spell exactly what he is. And beyond the family, if you know the city of Portland, Oregon, where Groening grew up, the whole town of Springfield starts to look familiar, because a huge number of the surname characters are named after real Portland streets. Flanders, Lovejoy, Quimby, Kearney, Terwilliger, and more, all of them street names from Groening's childhood city, smuggled into Springfield. He has said he originally intended to name every single character after a Portland street but ran out of time and simply got too busy, so the town ended up as a partial map of his hometown, a private geography hidden in plain sight, which is its own small answer to the question of where Springfield really is. It is not in any state. It is in a man's memory of the streets he grew up on. The single most famous sound in the entire show has an origin that almost nobody guesses, and it is one of the genuinely great pieces of trivia in all of television. Homer's exasperated cry, the one syllable that everyone on Earth can imitate, was never written. It does not appear in the scripts. When the writers wanted Homer to make that noise, they simply wrote, in parentheses, the stage direction annoyed grunt, and left it entirely to the actor to decide what an annoyed grunt sounds like. And Dan Castellaneta, the man who voices Homer, reached back to an old film comedian, a Scottish supporting actor from the Laurel and Hardy era who used to draw out a long, pained "oh" as a way of expressing frustration without actually swearing. Castellaneta borrowed that drawn-out sound, and then, at Groening's suggestion, clipped it short and sharp into the bark we know now. An improvised noise, built on a nearly forgotten actor's trick for dodging censorship in old black and white films, became so iconic that it was eventually added to the Oxford English Dictionary as a real word with a real definition. The most quintessentially Homer thing about Homer is a piece of pure improvisation that the writers never dared to try to spell. The music has a quiet mystery too, of the pleasant kind. The theme, that bright, tumbling fanfare you could hum in your sleep, was written by the composer Danny Elfman in about 2 days. He met with Groening, absorbed the feel of the thing, and sketched the melody in the car on the way home, and it came out so quickly and so completely that he has called it one of the easiest and most popular things he has ever written in a long career of famous scores. Some of art's most durable work comes from agony and revision, and then some of it just falls out of a man in a moving car in an afternoon, and there is no real explaining why one piece of music arrives that way and another does not. There are people behind the cartoon whose fingerprints are everywhere and whose names most fans could not tell you, and the largest of those quiet figures is a co-creator named Sam Simon. He was the one who built the writer's room in the early years, who assembled the original team of brilliant comedy writers and set the story-driven, character-first tone that made the series more than a gag machine. He shaped the thing profoundly, and then he clashed with the other creators and left, relatively early in the run, in the early 1990s, but he left on terms that meant he continued to be paid an enormous amount from the show's success for the rest of his life, tens of millions a year by some accounts, for a program he no longer worked on. He is one of the great half-hidden architects of modern television, a man who built the engine and then walked away from the car while it kept sending him checks, and most of the audience has never heard his name. The program itself nearly died before it began, and that is a mystery of a kind too, a story of how close the whole thing came to not existing. The very first full episode the team produced came back from the overseas animation studio in such rough, broken shape, so badly drawn and so full of errors, that a huge portion of it had to be thrown out and redone almost from scratch. It was a genuine disaster, bad enough that it shook everyone's confidence in whether the cartoon could even be made to a broadcast standard. And it is the reason the series did not launch with that episode at all. Instead, the premiere was shuffled, and the series went on the air for the first time with a Christmas special, the story of the family's threadbare holiday and the adoption of their greyhound, while the troubled first episode was delayed and fixed. Television's most successful animated series stumbled so badly on its very first attempt that it had to rearrange its own debut to hide the wreckage. Some of the cartoon's most famous jokes exist for reasons that have nothing to do with comedy and everything to do with the brutal math of making animation on a schedule. There is a legendary sequence in an early episode, a parody of a thriller, in which the villain Sideshow Bob steps on a series of rakes, and each one swings up and smacks him in the face, and he groans, and it happens again and again, far past the point of sense, one rake becoming many. That gag exists because the episode ran short. It came in under length, and the crew needed to fill time, so they simply repeated the rake over and over, working on a theory the showrunner has described since, that if you keep a joke going long enough, it stops being funny, and then if you keep going even longer, it becomes funny again on the other side. Funny precisely because of how absurdly long it refuses to end. The actor's pained groan was recorded a single time and then repeated for each rake. A piece of padding, born of a scheduling problem, turned into one of the program's most quoted sequences ever, which tells you something about how much of comedy is accident dressed up as intention. And the cartoon is full of tiny buried answers that reward the curious little mysteries with real solutions tucked into a corner of the frame. In the original opening titles, when the baby is scanned at the supermarket checkout, the price that rings up is a very specific number, $847.63, and that number was not random. It was, at the time the series began, an estimate of the monthly cost of raising a baby, a sour little joke about the expense of the child, hidden in the register readout where almost nobody would think to read it. Homer's middle initial, the mysterious J, was eventually revealed to stand for J, and it was chosen as a tribute to a legendary animator of an earlier era whose own characters carried J middle names, a private nod from one generation of cartoonists to another, and by some accounts the writers went back and forth over that small choice more than you would expect. Even the comic shop owner, the sarcastic collector, was eventually given a real name after years of not having one, and the name they chose, a flat, ordinary, forgettable one, was picked, by the program runner's own admission, specifically to annoy the fans who had been demanding to know it, a deliberately anticlimactic answer to a question people cared about too much. There is one origin claim, though, that I have to flag as unproven no matter how often you see it repeated, because it is exactly the sort of claim that gets stated as fact when it never was. Fans have long insisted that Groening hid his own initials in Homer's face, that the curve of Homer's ear and the line of his hairline together spell out the letters of the artist's name, a secret signature drawn into the character forever. It is a charming idea. It has never been confirmed by Groening himself, and it belongs in the category of fan theory rather than established fact, a thing people want to be true because it would be a lovely secret, but which the man who would know has never actually verified. I mention it precisely because it is the sort of detail that these videos love to state with total confidence, and I would rather tell you honestly that we do not know than sell you a secret that may only exist in the eye of the beholder. Even the villains carry hidden origins. Mr. Burns, the shriveled old plutocrat, is a composite of several real and fictional men stitched together. His face was based in part on a real media executive. His skeletal frame and the way he steeples his bony fingers were modeled deliberately on a praying mantis, giving him that insectile stillness. And the concept of the man drew on a famously reclusive shipping magnate and on a heartless banker from an old Christmas film. There is even a specific tic of his, the way he cannot remember his own employees and has to read their names off cards, that a writer lifted from something he had read about a real president. And the manic tycoon Hank Scorpio, the cheerful supervillain who runs a doomsday operation like a laid-back tech campus, is often claimed to be based on a famous real-world entrepreneur, but the writers have specifically said that is a misconception, that he was conceived as a riff on a classic James Bond villain, with much of his dialogue improvised on the spot by the actor who voiced him. Even the people who make Springfield's most memorable faces have watched fans confidently misidentify where those faces came from, which is, in the end, the recurring theme of this whole show. It is a machine that generates certainty in its viewers, and almost none of that certainty survives contact with the people who actually built it. The deeper you go into the background of this show, the more you find that some of its most quoted moments are tiny buried jokes with strange, specific stories behind them, and I could sit in this layer of the show all night. Consider the most relentlessly quoted scene of the entire modern internet. The little sequence where Principal Skinner invites his boss over for dinner, burns the roast, sneaks out to buy fast food burgers, and then tries to pass them off as his own home cooking under an invented name, insisting they are an old regional dish. That scene was written in a single afternoon, and its whole comic engine is a hidden rule about language. The writer, Bill Oakley, wanted food that rhymes so that steamed clams could slide into steamed hams in Skinner's Panicked Lie, and he deliberately set the story in a couple of ordinary upstate towns because their names sound familiar to an American ear without meaning anything in particular, funnier for being vaguely real and totally arbitrary. He has pointed out that it would not have landed nearly as well to reference a big, famous city. The whole scene is a machine built around words that are almost meaningless, and its immortality online decades later is the kind of thing no writer could ever plan. There is even a small extra joke buried in it that most people miss, which is that the food Skinner is presenting is, by his own description, steamed, while the picture plainly shows it being grilled, and the mismatch is just Skinner inventing nonsense on the spot to cover his lie. The cartoon has an odd relationship with words in general, and it has actually invented some. In an episode from the mid-1990s, 2 joke words are coined, both of them designed to sound like real vocabulary while being pure invention. One is used by a teacher who calls another word a perfectly cromulent word, and the other appears on a statue's motto, urging the town to embiggen itself, to make itself greater. They were gags, nonsense words made to sound plausible, and here is where it becomes wonderful. Those made-up words escaped the series and entered the real language. One of them, embiggen, turned out to have actually been coined once before, buried in an obscure text from the 1800s, which the program had no idea about and effectively resurrected. And then, years later, that silly cartoon word appeared, used completely in earnest, in a real peer-reviewed physics paper about the structure of the universe, scientists borrowing the joke word because it described what they meant. Eventually, the dictionary itself gave in and formally added both words as real entries. A pair of throwaway gags, written to be laughed at, argued their way into the actual English language and into the pages of serious science, which is a stranger and better legacy than most real words ever manage. Sometimes the buried joke is a whole secret history smuggled into the town's founding, and this is the payoff of a thread I left dangling earlier, when I mentioned that Springfield has more than once chosen a comfortable lie over the true story. The town worships its founder, a heroic pioneer named Jebediah Springfield, whose statue stands in the square and whose legend every child learns. In one episode, Lisa, doing careful historical research, discovers that the beloved founder was a fraud. The real man was a murderous pirate with a different name, a violent criminal who at one point tried to assassinate George Washington himself and who changed his name and reinvented himself as a noble frontier hero to escape his past. Lisa finds the proof, the confession hidden away for centuries, and she has the chance to expose the town's most sacred myth as a lie. And in the end, she chooses not to. She decides the comforting story does more good for the town than the ugly truth would, and she lets the legend stand. It is one of the sharpest things the cartoon ever did, a quiet parable about how nations build flattering myths about their founders, and then choose the myth over the facts, even when the facts are staring them in the face. And it rhymes, deliberately, with that whole pattern we keep seeing in Springfield, a town that would always rather agree not to look too closely. Some of the buried jokes are so well hidden that they are essentially private, rewards for the tiny fraction of viewers who catch them. There is a running gag involving a strange, surreal Japanese cleaning product commercial that Homer becomes obsessed with, featuring a grinning mascot who looks unsettlingly like him, and that whole sequence is built on layered, hidden logic. The mascot is explained, within the joke, as the accidental merger of two corporate logos, a smiling fish and a light bulb, combined into one uncanny face, and the trio of dancing women in the ad were modeled on the members of a real Japanese rock band, a specific in-joke aimed at people who would never in 1,000 years be expected to get it. The show is riddled with these background signs and shop names that hide a second meaning if you stop and read them, and fans often point to one recurring store, believed to sell farm supplies, whose name and slogan seem to conceal a crude rhyming joke that has become an internet legend of its own, precisely because it is so slyly filthy under an innocent surface. There is a moment where Bart, hunting for a novelty license plate with his name on it, can only find one reading a slightly wrong version of his name, and years later the series introduced knockoff versions of Bart and Lisa and, as fans love to point out, missed the chance to name the fake Bart after that very plate, fumbling its own perfect callback. These are not mysteries with dark answers. They are the accumulated private jokes of a writer's room that has been talking to itself and to its sharpest viewers for more than 30 years. Behind some of the program's music and its most surprising talent lies real hidden labor too. The parody jingle for A Ridiculous Oversized Truck, a song that fans adore, was performed by a famous country singer, lending real star power to a throwaway commercial gag most viewers assume was sung by some anonymous session musician. And one of the cartoon's oldest running bits, the prank calls Bart makes to the bartender, asking for customers with absurd punning names so that the bartender ends up shouting a filthy-sounding phrase across his bar, was not invented by the writers at all. It was lifted from a real set of bootleg recordings that circulated for years, genuine prank calls made to a real, endlessly furious bartender in New Jersey, whose taped explosions of rage became an underground legend. The writers took a piece of real-world folk comedy and gave it to Bart, and most of the audience has no idea they are hearing an homage to an actual tormented man from decades earlier. And then there are the two great lost collaborations, the ones that make you wonder what might have been, both involving pop superstars and both collapsing in ways stranger than fiction. First, there is the mystery of who really wrote the program's famous novelty rap song from its earliest merchandising days, the one that became a genuine chart hit. For years, Groening has claimed that Michael Jackson secretly wrote and produced it, but could not be credited for contractual reasons, telling the story again and again. And the man who is actually credited as the writer has publicly and pointedly disputed this, insisting that he is the sole author of the song, that Jackson contributed some backing vocals and the title, and an insistence that his name be worked into the lyrics, but did not write it. So even the authorship of one of the show's most successful pieces of music is a genuine he said, unresolved, with the credited writer and the cartoon's own creator telling flatly different versions of the same story. The second lost collaboration is my favorite piece of hidden history in this entire chapter, because it is so perfectly absurd. After the Michael Jackson episode, the program tried to make a sequel of sorts, a follow-up in which the same character returns, this time believing himself to be not Michael Jackson but Prince, to be voiced by Prince himself, and Prince agreed. A full script was written and reworked. Prince was on board. He even sent along detailed notes about his wardrobe for the character. And then the whole thing collapsed, because it turned out Prince was secretly championing a completely different, competing version of the script, one that had reportedly been written by his own chauffeur. He demanded that the chauffeur's script be used instead of the professionals. The writers refused to hand their episode over to be rewritten by a driver, and the entire project died on the spot. An episode of one of the biggest shows on television, with one of the biggest musicians alive attached and willing, was killed because a global superstar preferred a script his driver had written. The cartoon runner eventually released the unused pages online, a ghost of an episode that never was, and it remains one of the strangest almost happened stories in the program's history. I cannot leave this layer of the show without telling you about the man who wrote more of its classic episodes than almost anyone, and who is himself the biggest mystery among the writers, a near recluse who almost never gives interviews. He wrote dozens upon dozens of the best-loved episodes, and the stories about how he worked are the stuff of legend within the industry. He wrote in a diner booth, on enormous amounts of coffee and cigarettes, and when the law changed to ban smoking in California restaurants, rather than quit the habit, he reportedly bought an actual diner booth and installed it in his own home so he could keep smoking and writing in the exact posture he needed, and negotiated an arrangement to work from home and mail his scripts in. And his method, which he did once describe, is a small piece of genius about how to face a blank page. He would force himself to write a deliberately terrible complete first draft in one fast sitting, getting the whole broken thing out of his head, so that the next morning the script would already exist, however badly, as though, in his words, a crappy little elf had snuck into his office overnight and done all his work for him badly and then left, so that all he had to do was fix an elf's bad work rather than create something from nothing. That is the reclusive genius who shaped the golden years of the series, a man who beat the terror of the empty page by tricking himself into believing an elf had already filled it. There is more real craft and real human strangeness in that single image than in any prediction hoax you will ever be shown. There is a whole category of Simpsons mystery that most English-speaking viewers never encounter at all, and it lives in the cartoon's other lives, the dozens of versions of it that exist in other languages, where the town and its people become something subtly or wildly different. Because a show this popular gets dubbed and adapted all over the world, and every one of those adaptations makes choices, and some of those choices are their own strange stories. The boldest is a version made for the Arabic-speaking world, which did not simply translate the program, but rebuilt it to fit a different culture. Homer became a man named Omar. The family's name was changed, and the things that define Homer, his beer and his lazy afternoons at the tavern, were scrubbed away. The beer turned into soda. The bar transformed. The bacon and pork and hot dogs that fill his diet cut out or swapped for other meats, because those things did not fit the audience it was made for. It was Homer Simpson with his vices surgically removed, and perhaps it is no surprise that the experiment did not really work, that only a fraction of the adapted episodes ever aired before it was canceled. A Homer with no beer and no bacon, it turns out, is a puzzle the format could not quite solve. Even within a single language, the cartoon can split into rival versions with their own philosophies. In French, there are two entirely separate dubs, one made in France and one made in Quebec, and they take opposite approaches. The French version keeps things fairly standard and preserves the American references. The Quebec version does something much bolder, rendering the working-class characters, Homer and the police chief and the bartender, in thick local slang, the everyday French of working Quebec, while the more educated characters speak a more formal, international French, so that the class differences of Springfield get mapped onto the linguistic textures of Quebec society, and American places and figures get swapped out for local ones. It is essentially a different show, translated not just in words but in its whole social world, and fans of each version will tell you theirs is the real one. The saddest and most human of these translation stories comes from the Latin American Spanish dub, which for many millions of viewers was the only Simpsons they ever knew, voiced by a beloved cast who became as identified with the characters as the original American actors. In the mid-2000s, a labor dispute in the dubbing industry, a fight over union representation and working conditions, led to the entire original Latin American cast being replaced, fired in the middle of the show's run, including the actor who had given Homer his Spanish voice for years, a performer named Humberto Vélez, who, by his own account, had been earning only a tiny sum per episode for work that an entire continent adored. Audiences were furious. The replacement voices, through no fault of their own, were never quite accepted, and for a decade and a half the series in Spanish carried a faint wrongness for the people who had grown up with the originals. And then, years later, after the program changed corporate hands, the original voice of Homer was quietly brought back, returning to the role he had been forced out of, starting with a short film. It is a rare thing, a mystery of the program's history, that actually got a happy ending, a beloved voice restored to the character it never should have lost, though only after years of a whole continent hearing a stranger in Homer's mouth. Let me pull us back from the edges of the world and toward one last kind of in-universe mystery, maybe the most poignant one, which is the question of the future. The cartoon has shown us its own future many times, flashed forward to see what becomes of these children who will never actually grow up. And the strange thing is that none of those futures agree with each other, and the show does not want them to. In one famous flash forward, we see Lisa as a young woman about to be married, in a world of the near future that has since become the past. In another, we see her rise all the way to the nation's highest office, presiding over the country as an adult. In others, we glimpse the children grown and scattered in completely different arrangements, different careers, different loves, different fates, and these visions cannot all be true, because they contradict one another at every turn. The series is aware of this, and it tends to frame these glimpses carefully, as a fortune teller's vision, or a possible future, or one branch among many, rather than as fixed fact, so that no single one of them ever becomes the official destiny of the family. It is the floating timeline again, extended forward instead of backward. Just as the family has many contradictory pasts, it has many contradictory futures, and the program refuses to choose among them, because choosing would mean the children finally growing up, and growing up is the one thing they are never allowed to do. The future of The Simpsons is a room full of doors, and the cartoon will open any of them for a single episode and then close it again, so that the family can return, next week, to being exactly the age they have always been. That refusal has a strange consequence, one that becomes its own quiet mystery the longer the series runs. The Simpsons, essentially, cannot end. A normal story moves toward a conclusion, its characters age and change, and eventually arrive somewhere final. But a show built on a frozen timeline has no natural finish line, because nothing is allowed to permanently change, and so the show simply continues, year after year, decade after decade, outliving the technology it was born on, and the world it originally satirized. It has now been on the air for well over 30 years, it has passed its 800th episode, and it has been renewed years further into the future. And there is a real and genuine mystery in the simple question of how it ever stops. What would an ending even look like for a family that does not age? The program has joked about this itself, imagined its own finales, and then reset, because the reset is the whole nature of the thing. It is a story with no third act by design, a machine built to run forever, and somewhere in that endlessness is the deepest mystery of all, which is not any single unanswered question, but the strange fact of the cartoon's own immortality, a cartoon that has quietly become one of the longest continuous stories humans have ever told, still running, still unfinished, still refusing to let its children have a birthday. There is one more layer of hidden history I want to open before we start winding down, and it is the world of the writers themselves, and the guests, and the strange politics of who ends up inside the cartoon and who refuses. Because for every famous person who lent their voice to Springfield, there are others who said no, and the reasons they gave are their own little collection of mysteries. A beloved actor from a classic science fiction series is said to have turned down a part in one of the program's most famous episodes, the one about the town being conned into buying a useless monorail, and the story that has circulated among fans over the years is that he did not want to be seen mocking public transportation, which he took seriously. A legendary tough guy film star was asked to voice a dentist and declined. An aging former child star was asked to play a bitter old dance instructor and refused the unflattering role. And in a detail I find astonishing, every living former occupant of the White House over a long stretch of years was invited to appear on the show, and every single one of them said no, from one administration to the next, a whole unbroken line of the most powerful men in the country all deciding, independently, that they would rather not be animated yellow. The series that so many politicians name-checked and feuded with could not get a single one of them to actually show up. The feuds are part of the hidden history too. Early in the cartoon's life, a sitting president used it as a punching bag in a real speech, contrasting the nation he wanted with the messy cartoon family, wishing aloud that American families were more like a wholesome older show and less like The Simpsons. And the writers, rather than let it go, fired back from inside the program itself. They added a fresh joke to a rerun so that Bart could answer the president directly, pointing out that his family was praying for an end to hard times, just like the wholesome one, and later they built an entire episode around a thinly veiled version of that president moving in next door to The Simpsons and clashing with Homer, a story the writers have since described as a personal jab rather than a political one. It is one of the only times in history that a cartoon family has openly brawled with a head of state and, in the long run, rather won. Inside the writer's room, the mysteries are about how the sausage got made, and some of the methods are gloriously strange. One classic episode, a collection of little vignettes about the town's minor characters, divided its segments among the writers by having everyone write down their favorite characters, throwing the names into a hat, and drawing them out at random, so that the structure of a beloved episode was decided by literal luck of the draw. One showrunner, handed a list of demanded changes by the network's standards department for a science fiction-themed episode, reportedly waved most of the notes aside, and aired the episode close to how he had first envisioned it. The idea for the episode about the town's secret society, a parody of fraternal orders and their silly rituals, came to a showrunner while he was driving home and happened to hear a religious radio station discussing secret brotherhoods, and he turned that car ride into one of the program's most quoted musical numbers. And the writer's room itself has always been a strange pipeline, stuffed for decades with graduates of a single college humor magazine, an unusually specific breeding ground for the comic sensibility that shaped the whole thing, so that a huge share of Springfield was essentially dreamed up by alumni of the same student paper. Not all of the behind-the-scenes stories are charming, and honesty requires the harder ones too. The show's longtime composer, the man who wrote the music for hundreds of episodes across nearly 3 decades and was nominated for the industry's top awards many times over, was abruptly let go in his mid-70s, and he went on to sue the production, alleging that his firing was tied to his age and to a medical condition he had been diagnosed with, a bitter end to a very long collaboration. And by most accounts, the case did not end in his favor. And there is the mystery of the one episode in the entire run that carries no creator credit at all, a crossover with another animated show that Groening so strongly objected to, believing it violated the integrity of the cartoon's world and functioned as an advertisement for a different program, that when he could not get it stopped, he had his own name struck from the credits and publicly criticized the producer who pushed it through. Somewhere in the archive is a single half-hour that the program's own creator refused to put his name on, a quiet act of protest preserved forever in an absence. Some of the hidden credits are jokes in themselves. a famous dramatic actor who appeared in an early, tender episode as Lisa's substitute teacher, was nervous about being tied to a cartoon, and so he asked to be credited under a false name, and the fake name he chose was a sly little pun on a word for Jewish heritage, a private wink at his own background and his characters. And one of the cartoon's guest musicians attached a real condition to her family's appearance, insisting that if the family came on to convert Lisa to vegetarianism, then Lisa must remain a vegetarian permanently, that the cartoon could not undo it the following week for a joke. The show agreed, and Lisa has stayed a vegetarian ever since, one of the only permanent character changes the floating timeline has ever honored, locked in place by a pop star's request. That same musician even hid a secret in the end credits of the episode, a recording that, if you played one of his old songs backward, revealed him reciting a recipe, a buried joke waiting decades for someone patient enough to find it. Before we drift toward the end of the night, let me gather up a handful of the smaller mysteries, the odd little unresolved threads and quiet records that never quite fit anywhere else. The kind of thing you notice once and then wonder about for years. There is the mystery of the baby's voice. Maggie almost never speaks, which is part of what made her being the shooter so perfect, and for a long time her silence was total. But she has spoken, just barely, on rare occasions, and her very first word, delivered at the tender close of an early episode after Homer has left the room, was simply "Daddy," a single soft word that lands like a gut punch of sweetness. And that one word was voiced not by the program's regular cast, but by a legendary movie star of Hollywood's golden age, brought in for a one-word cameo, one of cinema's most famous actresses who ever lived, hired to say a single word as a cartoon baby. It is the kind of extravagant, hidden detail the series could afford at the height of its fame, a screen icon spending an afternoon in a recording booth to breathe one word into a nearly mute infant. There is the mystery of the endless fall, one of my favorite unresolved threads in the whole series. In an early episode about baseball, a real professional athlete playing himself goes looking for a local roadside attraction, a mysterious spot where the laws of gravity and perspective seem to bend, based on a real tourist trap that actually exists in California. He arrives, he steps inside, and he begins to fall, tumbling slowly into an endless, disorienting void, and the program cuts away, and he simply never comes back. Within the story, he is never rescued, never mentioned again, left falling forever into the mystery spot, a running gag with no resolution that fans still bring up decades later. A man lost in a hole in the world because the writers thought it was funnier to just leave him there. There is the mystery of the casting, the near miss that shaped the voices of two of television's most famous children in the world. When the actors first read for the roles, the woman who would become the voice of Bart had actually come in to audition for Lisa, and something about her reading of Bart on the spot was so right that she was cast as the boy instead, then and there. And the woman who became the voice of Lisa had read for Bart and been found too girlish for him, landing Lisa in the swap. The two most iconic child voices in television very nearly belong to each other, and the whole timbre of the cartoon, the specific sounds we think of as definitively Bart and definitively Lisa, exists because of a decision made in an audition room in a single afternoon that could easily have gone the other way. And there are the records, which are their own kind of quiet mystery, because it is genuinely hard to fathom how large this show has become. Its most watched single episode ever, a story about Bart cheating on a test, aired in the show's early years against the top-rated sitcom of its day and pulled in a number of viewers that the series has never come close to matching since. Tens of millions of people watching one episode of a cartoon on a single night, a high watermark from a vanished era of television when the whole country still watched the same thing at the same time. The program holds a world record for the most guest stars ever to appear in a television series, a tally that has climbed past 1,000 famous voices over the decades. It has won dozens of the industry's top awards, and it became the first animated series ever to win one of broadcasting's most prestigious honors. When the movie came out, a real convenience store chain converted a dozen of its actual stores into working versions of the cartoon's fictional shop, selling the fictional products made real, the pink donuts and the strange sodas, and sales at those stores reportedly doubled. A contest was held among the real American towns named Springfield to decide which would host the movie's premiere, and a small town in Vermont won it by the narrowest of margins, drawing a national vote of astonishing size for the honor of a single evening's premiere. These are the footprints of a show that stopped being merely a television program a long time ago and became a piece of the shared furniture of modern life, so woven into the culture that a made-up donut shop can be built in the real world and a dozen real towns will fight over a cartoon's attention. And that, in the end, is the largest and gentlest mystery of all, the one that contains all the others we have wandered through tonight. Not who shot Mr. Burns, which we know, and not what state Springfield is in, which we never will, but the simple, staggering fact of how a rough little cartoon, drawn crudely by accident, colored yellow to catch a wandering eye, voiced by a handful of people improvising grunts and stolen accents, grew into something so enormous and so permanent that it now has more unanswered questions attached to it than most countries have history. Every one of the mysteries we have touched, the vanished characters and the buried jokes and the futures that will not line up and the predictions that were mostly never real, they are all just the natural sediment of a story that has been running so long and been loved so hard that it has accumulated the mythology of something much older than a television show. People do not build fan theories and freeze frames and endless arguments around things they do not love. The mysteries exist because the attention never stopped, and the attention never stopped because, somewhere under all the yellow and all the jokes, the cartoon got something true about being a family, about being stuck with the people you are stuck with, about muddling through a world that makes no sense, and it got it well enough that people have kept watching for 35 years and counting. Looking for answers the show was always too wise, or too playful, or too tired to give them. So maybe the right way to hold all of this is the way Groening always wanted us to hold the question of where the town is. Not as a problem to be solved, but as a space to be comfortable in. The Simpsons was built, from its very first frames, to be a place you could believe was your own, set in a town that could be your town, in a state the series would never name so that it could be yours. And all the little unsolved things, the graffiti nobody traces, the founder nobody exposes, the baby nobody suspects, the future nobody settles, are part of the same gift, an invitation to keep wondering about a place that was designed, with great care and great affection, to never quite come into focus. You are not supposed to solve Springfield, you are just supposed to live there for a while, on a quiet night like this one, and let it stay a little bit unknowable. We have wandered a long way tonight, from a hilltop where a man named 4 impossible states. Through the summer, a whole country tried to catch a killer who turned out to be a baby. Past the empty chairs of everyone who left, through the doctored screenshots and the real coincidences, and into the fights and secrets and accidents that made the best-known cartoon on Earth. And what stays with me, at the end of all of it, is how much of what we love about this show came from things going slightly wrong. The rough drawings that got traced instead of cleaned up, the episode that ran short and needed a rake, the grunt nobody wrote down, the elf that never existed sneaking into an office overnight. For all its reputation as the program that saw the future, the truth is that The Simpsons has mostly been a beautiful accident, a thing that kept stumbling into greatness and then, being too busy to stop, just kept going and going and going until it had quietly outlasted nearly everything it once made fun of. There is a strange comfort in that, in the idea that something can be this imperfect, this contradictory, this full of loose ends and abandoned threads, and still be beloved, still be running, still be here with us on a dark night decades later. It never needed to have the answers. It only ever needed to make us keep asking. Thank you for spending these hours in Springfield with me, drifting through its mysteries in the dark. This has been Donuto, and if the sound of these questions and half-answers helped quiet your mind and carry you toward sleep, then it did exactly what it was meant to do. Let the town stay unmapped, let the founder keep his secret, let the baby keep her flicker of a smile, and let yourself rest. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe and I'll see you in the next one.